Well, good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to first start by welcoming you all here today for this public lecture by Mr. Jürgen Maier, and I hope I pronounced his name correctly.
Perfect.
And as you know, the title of this presentation is the UN's Post-2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Positions, Suggestions, and Insights from a German NGO point of view. Now, this talk has only been possible thanks to your kind acceptance of our invitation to come here to speak to us today. And what we really had hoped, what we do come And what we had really hoped for in having Mr. Maier with us here today is to be able to really do three things. So one, really to understand the process that was used to determine 8 key issues that are part of an important position paper entitled 8 Key Issues for a Post-2015 Global Development and Sustainability Agenda. And I'm realizing now that the titles are mouthfuls, but it's this report which the examples of that all have later. But to understand the process used to pair what is now the 17 SDGs down to 8 key areas, but also the rationale behind determining those 8 key issues, and perhaps even also the details or the nuances of these 8 key issues that have been identified. But to give you more important information that you're probably seeking is that Mr. Jürgen Maier is the director of the German NGO Forum on Environment and Development. And this, the German NGO Forum, for short, was founded in December 12, 1992, after the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio. Please come in. And the intention for this organization is to serve as a network for both environmental and development civil service organizations, with the main objective to coordinate Germany's CSOs in both national and international political processes, especially on sustainable development. Hence this report that you speak to us about today. Like as most of you also know, really this year 2015 is quite a significant year. It marks the end of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, which in many ways have come with mixed results. I think particularly of education, where there have been some successes in terms of access to universal primary education, but along the way, questions of quality in education, lifelong learning, the importance of secondary education, or let's say the multiplying effects of secondary education and tertiary education, etc., have been lost. And in a sense, the post-2015 agenda has really been discussions that in some ways are not actually about new things, but about reinvigorating some old debates when we think about that, even around questions of equity and so on and so forth. One can also argue that in this contemporary time as well, ICTs have enabled what has been, or many are now seeing as quite a broad engagement of multiple stakeholders in the development or the putting forward of a post-2015 agenda, which we now have as the 17 goals, and what some are saying as unwielding 169 targets that imply over 500 plus indicators. So really, without too much ado, the assumption is this report will really speak to questions around the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's also really important that we have it here today, because also very recently the German Development Institute also put out a report that is looking at the 17 SDGs as well as the SDSN's report that is trying to operationalize these SDGs. So it would be interesting to get your perspective in light of all this information. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, for this kind of introductory words. And as Stefania said, the German NGO Forum was basically the product of one of these UN conferences on environment and development back in Rio, 1992. A conference that in 92 was criticized by many people as failing, as not delivering what it was supposed to deliver, We said that, a lot of the media said that, many governments said that, but in hindsight, many conferences look brighter than they were during the time when it was held. So the Rio conference, 92, had as its probably most important result, Agenda 21, a blueprint for the 21st century, basically 200-something pages, 40 lengthy chapters, a blueprint for the new century. And NGOs at that time were also very encouraged to contribute to implementing Agenda 21, so that was the reason why my NGO network was formed. And we were based at that time in Bonn, like so many German institutions, we later moved to Berlin. And the follow-up conferences, Rio +5 in 1997, Rio +10 in 2002, held in Johannesburg, were all basically already conferences where people, governments themselves, but also NGOs and the media, had to essentially agree on the fact that a lot of the Agenda 21 promises and commitments were not implemented, were only partly implemented, there were problems in the implementation and things like that. So for a long time it was not sure whether Rio +20, the conference held in 2012, would actually make sense, because for another doom and gloom conference where everybody says, oh, we didn't do our homework, oh, we should have done more, nobody really had a feeling for such type of conference, except for the government of Brazil. Brazilians wanted to have another Rio conference in 2012, and they were lobbying so much until the General Assembly finally said, okay, you will have your Rio +20 conference. The Rio +20 conference then was initially another of these Rio Plus conferences, not many results, and people were criticizing this is a waste of money, it was just for some heads of state to show up and hold grandiose speeches and fly home. Some other heads of government didn't even bother to show up, like the Chancellor of Germany, because she said this is going to be not a conference where I will be seen in a very good light, so I rather don't show up. Sometimes, as I said, the Rio conference in 92, in hindsight, was a very important conference, it made a difference in history, and I'm beginning to be tempted to say the same thing about Rio +20. Why? Because in Rio 2012, one of the conference results was a little detail that was at that time essentially not taken too seriously. There was a commitment by governments to agree or to negotiate until 2015 a set of what they called Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals was something that was deliberately coined after the Millennium Development Goals, a set of development goals agreed in 2000 at the UN General Assembly. And these Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, were of course not binding. A government was not sort of forced to implement that. But the MDGs became essentially the key word for the development community, for development institutions in the years after 2000. It was a set of 8 development goals with a number of sub-goals and targets and indicators. And very soon, after the 2000 summit at the UN, institutions that were funding development projects, development programs, were checking, does it contribute to the MDGs or not? And if your project, if your program was actually found not to contribute to the MDGs, it had a very bad chance to get funded, so the MDGs became a reference point. Now the MDGs were of course targeted until 2015. So this is the year where we are basically taking stock, and we have to see, or we have to admit quite a number of the MDGs are not fulfilled. There are some important successes, but if you look at the details, like poverty eradication, there were impressive progress was made. But if you look at the details, a good part basically comes from China and India. And in many other countries, not very much has happened. In some other areas, the MDGs were 5 or 6 years ago closer to being fulfilled than now, because it's not static development. For instance, the fight against hunger. You have seen rising food prices, speculation with food. So the number of people going hungry, like 3 years ago, was more than 1 billion, the highest figure ever. Now it's going down again, so it's not a static thing. However, the Rio decision to agree SDGs was, in a way, an idea that came from totally from outside the UN system. Normally, these UN conferences have basically they have results that are discussed in the UN system for years in advance, and it's not really something where you see big surprises. To negotiate SDGs was not in the original summit agenda as it was discussed in the UN negotiation process. It was a proposal brought into the negotiations at a rather late stage by two countries that normally are not necessarily the environmental pioneers. It was Colombia and Guatemala, two right-wing Latin American governments who normally in UN negotiations are really not the environmental pioneers, but they had progressive environmental ministers at that time, and they said, okay, Rio must be more than just a declaration that we will do our best to implement Agenda 21 in the future, blah, blah, blah. We have to come in with a new, sort of more measurable program for implementing sustainable development. Now, Colombia and Guatemala, who is that? Are they important? Can we ignore them? That was the original debate, and even those countries like Germany, who would like to be seen as environmental pioneers, were not really happy with this idea. Some people cynically say they were not happy with this idea because it was not their idea, but some other people's idea. Never mind, the whole thing became important when host nation Brazil basically said, yes, this is a good idea, we are part of the proposal. So it was Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, and then it could no longer be ignored. And it became part of the final declaration of the Rio +20 summit, and then you had this decision, the UN is going to negotiate SDGs. In the UN headquarters, they were not sure where to place these negotiations. It was not the business of one of the UN's commissions, it was not the business of the General Assembly. Where do we put that? And then you also had this MDG negotiation process already in place for 15 years. And it was already clear the MDGs will be renewed. So after 2015, there will be MDG2 running until 2030. And then you have this parallel track, SDGs. How does that fit together? It was, first of all, a big confusion. And you had both tracks essentially running in parallel. In the UN General Assembly, an open-ended working group was formed to negotiate the likely components, the likely content of the Sustainable Development Goals. In parallel, the MDG negotiation process had a high-level panel proposing the second set of MDGs. So it was only until December last year when the UN Secretary General formally proposed, let's merge these two negotiation tracks. It doesn't make sense to have a set of MDGs and a set of SDGs. Maybe they're contradictory, maybe they're not contradictory, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. So that is now official, and the negotiations are now taking place in, for UN terms, almost in record speed. They started in January, and they're supposed to deliver a result until September. September is going to be the General Assembly, like every year, and in September the whole new set of development goals is supposed to be agreed. They could call it the post-2015 agenda. Sounds a little bit strange, but that comes from the MDG background. They run until 2015. So what was looked for was the post-2015 agenda, because you couldn't really call it MDGs again, because MDGs comes from Millennium, and that was 2000, now it's 2015, so that's how you end up with these complicated names. Post-2015 agenda, the open-ended working group has proposed a set of 17 sustainable development goals with 169 indicators, and that is, on the first look, you might think this is a lengthy thing, but compared with Agenda 21, it's almost like a mini version. What is even more surprising, there was, for UN purposes, very large agreement of these 17 Millennium SDGs. The big difference between the MDGs and the SDGs is they are supposed to be a universal agenda. Universal means for all countries. The MDGs was poverty alleviation in developing countries, and of course the rich nations generously help. That was the old MDGs. Now we have what they call a global partnership for sustainable development. And a number of governments only belatedly realized what the universal agenda means. It means something has to be done in the north, like the British government is started at the end of last year to lobby for watering down 17 targets, 17 goals is too many, nobody can communicate 17 goals, let's water it down, and they were looking at the environmental component of the SDGs, which they didn't like, but everybody now, I think, agrees that if you open this 17 goals again, this package, this compromise deal reached in 2014, if you open that, then you probably will make a decision at the General Assembly 2016, but not this year. So chances are good that this proposal from this open-ended working group is going to be agreed in the end. The big other difference between the old MDGs and the SDGs is, of course, the content. At the Rio conference 2012, we had a big pile of reports that were published, stock-taking reports, governments reporting about their implementation of Agenda 21, of the UN commitments in the various Rio conventions, such as climate, biodiversity, etc. And you had also many reports about implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. And generally speaking, you could say the Millennium Development Goals implementation reports were showcasing a lot of successes. Many governments proudly said we have reduced poverty, we have increased our health supplies, we have reduced hunger, things like that. There were quite a number of successes in terms of development. But if you look at the environmental reports, that was a completely different picture. It was doom and gloom. The climate is heating up. We are using the atmosphere as a dump for CO2 emissions. The oceans are overfished, are depleted from marine life, are filled with garbage. You have soil erosion, deforestation, all these things, you know it. So, in a way, you could argue if the development reports would have been even more successful, the environmental reports would have been more doom and gloom. Because our current model of economic development is exploitation of natural resources and using the atmosphere as a dump for carbon dioxide. So it was clear this type of economic development is eroding its very base, where it's built. So the difference between development and sustainable development is clear. Sustainable development is supposed to keep the natural resources where economic development depends on. And this is the challenge that we will face in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now the commitments that are going to be made in the SDG agenda are to some extent vague enough to allow governments to agree to them, because if they're becoming too concrete, governments may say they're not agreeing to them. But at the same time, they're precise enough that you cannot simply say, okay, let's continue business as usual. how difficult it was to make an old MDG development agenda into a new sustainable development agenda became obvious even among NGOs. When we discussed after Rio in our network, okay, SDGs, should we take that seriously? Is that going to fly, or is it just another nice greenwashing component of the Rio conference? We said, oh, let's take it seriously, but we also have to say what it means. What is, in our view, the difference between economic development as usual and sustainable development? And the first difficulty was that all our environmental experts, our environmental NGOs said, look, this approach of 15-year plans, it's almost like a socialist economy. We are not used to thinking in these terms. We say nuclear power should be closed down immediately, and not for 15 years. If a pesticide is dangerous, we say it should be forbidden now, and not in 15 years. Why should we wait with cleaning up our rivers for 15 years? We can do it now. Why should we stop overfishing only in 15 years? Why not now? This is the environmental community is thinking in different terms. The development community, of course, they know you cannot end hunger tomorrow. It takes time. The environmental community has a different approach. So to bring this mindset in somehow in harmony was already difficult enough. And then you say, okay, then we have to discuss what is realistic. You can produce all types of wishful thinking. And when you talk about international politics, you talk about governments that have to agree on something, and you know certain things they will never agree. So NGOs, of course, always propose something that is a little bit more advanced than what governments would agree. It is our role, but it cannot be completely pie in the sky. So we had to do, to our own surprise, our own process of discussion was slower than we thought. And we first produced a paper addressing the ecological aspect, environmental aspect of sustainable development goals. If you are interested, I have 15 copies, but you can also see it on our website. And that was the first step to come to this other paper, which is the paper of NGOs in Germany with our proposals for a comprehensive sustainable development goals. The idea to integrate these economic and environmental aspects posed to be more difficult than we thought. You also have the idea that sometimes quick economic development means you have to sacrifice certain environmental constraints or certain environmental ideas. And that is also a temptation that is very strong in the environmental community, in the development community. So we said, look, this mistake was made 10 years ago after Rio. We essentially ignored the sustainability aspects, and then we see it now all these reports, what have we done? We will not be able to feed a planet of 7 billion people if the erosion of soils continues the way it happens now. So we're not talking about an ecological problem. It is an ecological problem, of course, but it's also a problem for economic development if we destroy the natural resource that we need to feed the world. And this is something where I think in our paper we have come to a very good result now. The UN process that is now taking place is going to end up in a 4-component decision at the General Assembly in this September. It will be a declaration basically saying why the whole thing takes place. This declaration is being negotiated. Don't expect too much content. It will be a lot of, let's put it that way, sullen blah blah, with all respect. And then the second and the most important component of this decision in September will be the set of sustainable development goals and indicators, most likely the 17 ones that the open-ended working group has agreed. And their indicators, maybe they will be regrouped a little bit, and maybe they will be renamed a little bit, but don't expect too many changes. Then will be a more controversial part, the means of implementation. Of course, one of the big problems of Agenda 21 in 92 was there was no money attached to it. So if you are a poor government, and the international community asks you to do all kinds of things in terms of sustainable development, and you don't have the money, then you say, okay, nice idea, but we can't do it. And the rich countries in Agenda 21 said, yeah, but we are talking about development problems, so we maybe increase a little bit our ODA, but basically it's not our job. The post-2015 agenda will be different, and it will be very important to have means of implementation attached to it. There's going to be a financial conference, Financing for Development, in Addis Ababa in June. Not many people watch it. It's not really on the agenda of too many policymakers, but it will be very important for the implementation component of the SDGs. And last but not least, the fourth component that will be agreed in September is the follow-up and review process. Because that is also something that we didn't really have in the old MDGs and the Agenda 21. Is going to be an institutionalized follow-up procedure where governments check, okay, where are we? Are we on track? Are we lagging behind? What do we have to do more? Things like that. This is also something where it becomes sometimes a little bit tricky because governments don't really want to be inspected by international bodies, checking them. You know, you have to think of something like the Troika coming to Germany and checking, you're still polluting the world's oceans too much. We have to do something so that you get in line with your commitments. It's not going to be that way, and it's certainly not going to be called the Troika, but we're talking about something comparable. Governments don't really like that. And of course, if you don't check it, it's the danger that nothing happens is very high. And of course, we as NGOs always try to be a little bit of this sort of thorn in your ass. Look, do something more, but in many countries, governments are restricting the ability of NGOs to do that severely. So basically, this is what we're talking about. In Germany, the government so far has taken a rather proactive approach to this negotiations. This is because it was the Environment Ministry and the Development Ministry taking the lead, and the Economic Ministry, the Finance Ministry ignoring the process so far. So it's easy to be progressive. The difficulty will be when it comes to implementation, and they understand what happens. In some countries, we have already national sustainable development strategies. Germany is one of them. Most Germans don't know that because this national sustainable development strategy is not important. To be blunt, it's so unimportant that the valid one, the one that we have in Germany, was agreed in 2002, that was like 3 governments before, agreed from a chancellor that nobody, that has no influence anymore, with another party that is in opposition. So the current ruling coalition government, or after every change of government, you should have expected the National Sustainable Development Strategy should be changed, because look, the new government, they left it as it is. It was not important enough to be changed. Our idea is also that the National Sustainable Development Strategy, after the SDGs is are agreed, and we talk about implementation, then we need a comprehensive update of our National Sustainable Development Strategy. And then we need a strategy that's taken seriously and not a strategy that's forgotten. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. I have a few more copies of that paper. If you want it printed in color, but it's also as PDF, I think, on our website, and I'm happy to answer all questions or discuss with you the perspectives of that process. Or also maybe you think this whole process is going to end up like all the previous Rio documents and declarations. Maybe you agree with me that we have a chance to make more out of it. I'm happy to discuss that with you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll see now if people have questions with regards to presented with that right now.
Okay, I'll give it a start. Could you give me or give us more information about your thoughts about the verification process? What do you think is gonna come out of this? Kind of a development bank or a fund or some kind of a stringent financial provision to implement these SDGs, or do you think that this will result also in some sort of a lackluster free-for-all?
Well, I think what is unlikely is that there is going to be a new institution. Mm-hmm. Because we already have so many institutions, so many funds, and it doesn't really make sense to add another one. We have the World Bank, regional development banks, all kinds of other funds, and they, so far, are, I think everybody agrees, not paying enough attention to the sustainability aspects. Mm-hmm. This is not because of that these people are too stupid to understand that. It's because of different political priorities. If you only look at the G20 summit last November in Brisbane, G20 agreed on an additional economic growth program. 800 single measures were committed by governments to boost economic growth by 2.1%. It's almost like a planned economy. You can plan economic growth. But if you look at these 800 measures, a lot of them were not sustainable. Expansion of coal mines and things like that has nothing to do with sustainability. So you have to bring in line these funding institutions with a set of goals that the UN agrees. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's asking too much. And then that means you have to tick certain new aspects, and if they don't meet sustainability criteria, the funding institution, the World Bank, has to say no, we're not funding that. Mm-hmm. You want to divert a river? You want to destroy a forest ecosystem for soy plantations? No money. Something like that. Mm-hmm. But this is still negotiated, mm-hmm. and this is where it becomes very, very tough. Mm-hmm. And the verification aspect. The Germans are proposing that the UN agrees on some peer review mechanism. So not an international institution, not a UN agency comes to an individual country and checks, but you invite your neighbors to do that. Maybe Germany would invite France. No, come, can you please evaluate us? Now that is maybe more realistic, but of course it's also, there's a danger that you say, look, and you are friendly to our implementation, and then you invite us and we will be friendly to you. Of course, but they say it should not be only one country, it should be three. So these three make such deals a little bit more complicated. I think it's a nice idea, it's a good approach. Probably not sufficient, but things like that will be there. So you have it on the agenda of the UN every year. How far are we in implementation? Mm-hmm. That is the idea.
Thank you. I'm Tifai Brown from Nigeria. I just wanted to ask on the first goal of eradicate extreme poverty and overcome inequality. Because from your presentation you said the MDG was not universal, but this is going to be universal. So some countries still didn't achieve the MDG poverty, halving its poverty target, but this time eradicate. Would that also apply for both developing and developed countries, or to be poverty eradication for developing countries and overcoming inequality for developed countries? I'm just trying to ask, how does this cuts across universal?
But I mean, of course, you already said the old MDGs only wanted to halve poverty, eradicate 50%. Now we want to eradicate everything. There's a lot of people also criticize from a human rights point of view. It's a bit offensive to say, let's remove only half of the human rights violations. So the new approach is a little bit more interesting. And of course, the old idea that poverty exists in developing countries and in the north, everybody is rich, nobody would say that anymore. There is poverty in the north. Of course, it's a different form of poverty. Absolutely, poverty is different in every country, but it would be part of it. And argue that means Germany or the United States have to report on the poverty level in their countries. How has inequality increased or decreased in their countries? Things like in the United States, 1/3, no, not 1/3, but I don't have to figure, but quite a number of people have no health insurance. So that is poverty. In Germany, this would be considered poverty. In Greece, it's 1/3. In Greece, sorry. Things like that would be part of the agenda. But of course, this first goal is essentially a continuation of the MDGs, but there is not so much of a sustainability component in it. This is social justice.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I'm more concerned about how it's going to be implemented. The way it has been implemented in the past, like MDGs, lots of money has gone through project-based funding. And I understand the Accra Declaration, as so many declarations has come to overcome or move out of project-based funding. But what is it going to happen? We already had, I think, 4 declarations on that angle, how to implement these goals. And we do find that many of the funding agencies are not streamlining their way of implementation as per the declaration. Now, where do we go from here? Because if you see some of the goals that has not been implemented, it's more like the conditions that they put in mainly to target the goal and meet the goals. Like in 1970s and 80s, we used to blame the government that they are a target-based approach. And now we have to blame the international agencies who are going on a target-based approach. They need to build this many toilets, they need to build this many drinking water sources. They're not talking about sustainability of those things. So the first point is on that, what is it going to happen in terms of implementation? What is the, are they going to respect these sort of declarations or not? The second is, with the goals always put in some timelines, like 2030. Before it was 2050, and now it is 2030. Many of these development goals cannot be achieved or not necessarily to be achieved on a time-bound measures. Then you will not have a sustainability level to it. And many funding agencies are taking a very short track kind of an approach or firefighting approach, basically targeting the number or the goal targets rather than sustainability. And it is also being blended, or many researchers are also taking that part in a way. And they're not worried about sustainability of things. They are more acting as a mouthpiece for the funding agencies. Now, how do we address these two? Because these goals have really brought out some of the issues in many of the countries on top of their agenda. But if you see the game that is played by the international agencies and international research communities, it is going in a different directions. Your comments will be useful.
Yeah, in the first part, means of implementation, I think this is so far the most sort of unclear aspect of what will be agreed in September. Of course, you have people, and many development NGOs as well, who simply think it's a question of how much money is on the table. I personally disagree with this approach, because if I look at my daily routine, a lot of the emails that I get, emergency alarm campaign, stop this and this project, stop this dam, stop this coal mine, blah, blah, things like that. A lot of that is funded by ODA money. So I think it's not a question of how much money, it's also a question of what do you do with that money. And this is something where I think after the UN General Assembly in September, the main work will start. And that also comes to the second part of the question. We are talking about a power struggle, essentially. You have the G20 summit in November. That is business as usual in the worst form. It was chaired by Australia, a government that so far has done everything to break down existing environmental laws, to promote coal exports. This is a backward government. A government that doesn't know what sustainability is and essentially fights against its implementation. And then you have this UN process going into a totally different direction, so far maybe ignored by ministries of economics and trade ministries and things like that. But it's going to be an agenda that will be, or will have to be, put against business as usual. It is going to be an important tool to argue for a change of course. I don't say it will perfectly work out. The world doesn't operate like that. We're talking about powerful forces that want business as usual to continue, because this is their business model. And we need different business models. Overfishing is another thing that has already been agreed several times we should stop it. And every time you come to the implementation, you have basically made the big mistake to delegate it to fisheries ministers. They're the worst ones. They're the problems. They are responsible for the problem. So the idea then is you cannot delegate it to the Minister of the Environment because they're not in charge, so it has to be the whole cabinet of a country has to be in charge. And then maybe you get this famous problem of coherence. I'm not saying it works, but for us it's going to be an important tool for the political debate, and we will say, look, the UN has agreed to that, you have agreed in the UN to that, where is the action? I'm not promising that it will always work out, but it's going to be an important new tool for community of NGOs, community of people who want to make money with more sustainable business models. We're also talking about a considerable part of the business community. We're talking about more progressive governments, so it's always going to be sort of a struggle between interests. But what I'm arguing for is it's going to be a new boost, because Agenda 21 is too old. The MDGs are ending this year, so we need something new, and maybe something better.
Yeah, thanks. I'm quite interested in how you sort of mentioned it's a new tool, yeah, and basically it will help legitimize action. And if we then, I would like to encourage you to look a little bit again at Germany, because of course implementation will be an issue. You already mentioned that some ministries have been very heavily involved, while some of the key ministries have not at all been involved so far, economics and justice. So can you, and how does the NGO scene in Germany also reflect on this implementation on the German side? I'd like to know a bit more.
Since we're talking about a global agenda here, in my view, the new post-2015 agenda will be an important tool also to raise questions that the environmental movement in Germany would not necessarily put first. Of course, environmentalism always comes from people are becoming active because they see a problem where they live. Somebody destroys a forest, the lake where they live is dirty, the river is dirty, they have clean air problems, things like that motivates people to become active. But with the post-2015 agenda, we're talking about a little bit more abstract concept. And in our position paper, the concept of the ecological footprint plays an important role. What is the ecological footprint? Germany, for instance, has an ecological footprint that goes far beyond anything that you can call sustainable. We occupy, not occupy in a military sense, but we use 120% of our agricultural area to produce the food that we consume, or that we maybe buy and throw away. 120%. 20% of our agricultural area we have in South America, Brazil and Argentina, 3.5 million hectares of soy plantations. This soy goes to Germany and feeds animals to produce meat. So not every country can have 120% of its agricultural land because we have only a limited planet. Planetary resources, planetary boundaries is what we're talking about. And you can have sustainability in a limited planet on very unjust terms. And the Germans have their 120, and maybe the Paraguayans then have 80. Or I don't know, But that is not justice. So the ecological footprint has to come in line with a limited planet. And that means, of course, we have to reduce our ecological footprint. And that is a more abstract concept of environmentalism than what the neighbor of maybe a highway project would think. And it is also something where I believe we will have very, very difficult decisions. Because that means you have to change the way you live. We can only do that because other parts of the world are poor. They don't have the purchasing power for that soil. And then we're talking about redistribution. Now, of course, there are limits to that, and we have seen in election campaigns in Germany how difficult that is. But the answer cannot be to ignore it. Ecological footprint is also something that refers to energy use, to atmosphere use, as a CO2 dumping site. It refers to raw materials. All that has to come in line with what a limited planet can supply. And this is also the difference between development and sustainable development. I was, at some point I asked the director of the Rio Plus 20 conference what he thinks is the difference between sustainable development goals and development goals. And his answer was, the sustainable development goals respect the planetary boundaries, and the development goals ignore them. And that is the difference. So far we have refused as an international community to respect planetary boundaries. We have assumed development means everybody consumes more, everybody increases his or her ecological footprint. That was development. And it's no longer possible.
I know we had 3 questions, but maybe we'll take 2 of them, so not and then. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I was looking on the SDGs as proposed by this open working group that you also mentioned. I mean, I think this is downloadable somewhere in the internet, and also I think several institutes have reported and commented on it already. But I was wondering, I mean, reading through all these 17 goals, I was thinking that almost none of them can ever be achieved. Really? I mean, how can you achieve goal number 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere? Maybe, I mean, theoretically it might be possible, but practically never ever, I think, right? Or goal 2, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but no, honestly, but I mean, is it by purpose that these goals, at least as proposed by the Open Working Group, are that rigorous and, you know, almost not achievable?
Now, of course, you have, in a way, you have history on your side. What I'm arguing for is something that has never happened in history. So, in a way, you can say this is all illusionary. On the other hand, look at this whole example as if you were in Tehran in a carpet bazaar. Somebody wants a high price, somebody wants a low price, and somewhere you meet in the middle. And the higher the price you want as the salesman, maybe the higher is what you get. So the MDGs made a mistake of asking only for half of poverty to be eradicated, and what have we got? Not even that. If you now say, okay, this was a mistake, I need more for my carpet, you ask for more. Maybe this is a little bit funny. We're talking about very serious things. But this is essentially the way I think you should look at it. You need ambitious goals in order to get the world in motion. If these goals that you present look like they can be achieved with business as usual, you have already lost. What we need is a momentum for something else than business as usual, for a joint enterprise. We as a world community, as international community, have agreed on an ambitious set of goals. And now we have to do something for it. Now, of course, I also know we will not get 100%. I know it. You are right. But maybe 60% rather than 25% makes a difference. So this is, I think, the rationale behind it. Is that coincidence?
Yeah, I mean, this is also where I asked. Okay, but yeah, thank you.
And actually, I think jumping in a bit, the DIU report talks about this lack of not being achievable. I think that's some of the critique. But,
maybe add something on this. The MDGs were very health focused. I'd say about 40%, 3 out of 8, were very clearly targeted at health. The SDGs is 1 out of 17. So there's a clear de-emphasizing of at least of human health. And if you look at the health indicators or the health goals in the MDGs, some of them were really specific. I mean, they were addressing specific diseases. So they're very technical in a way. And if you compare the 17 that are proposed now, they are very, they're up in the sky. Now, I'm not arguing for this way or that way, but if you have really clear targets, if you say, I'll give you another 5 years and then polio is history, you've got something tangible. Whereas if you say end poverty in all its forms, by definition this is something up in the sky, very vague. What's your point on this?
I mean, you also have to look at the way the MDGs were developed. It was a panel of technocrats working on the MDGs for the UN Secretary General. There was no involvement of governments, and the report that I presented to the Secretary General was then presented to the international community in the General Assembly in 2000, and they said, okay, we vote for that. The SDGs are written by governments themselves, not by a panel of technocrats. They are negotiated. They're not simply adopted as a report of technocrats, they are negotiated between governments. So it fully reflects the political priorities of the governments of the world. And by extension, also the civil society, because civil society has lobbied governments very strongly in this negotiation process, and we gave a lot of emphasis on influencing that process. So, in a way, it's more balanced. De-emphasizing health, I mean, if you say it's now only 1 of 17 and not 40% anymore, it doesn't mean this is not important. It simply points out that a number of other things are now also on the table. And health, I think I should add that as well. Health is not simply giving people so and so many vaccines and so many health stations. It's also about preserving natural basis of life. If you live in an environment of dirty air, you get sick. If you say, okay, environmental sustainability means clean rivers, clean air, you are also doing something for health. So in a way, I think a more holistic understanding of health may lead closer to the 40% that you have discovered in the MDGs.
Yeah, I just want to get your position. It might be different from what they're asking. It's about the growing population, because it's like it really affects the equation of sustainable development. And what is the position of the NGOs and how it is really being taken, into account in these SDGs and post 2015?
This is always a tricky issue, and the UN conferences on population are always very tricky, very heated, because very quickly you have religious and ideological predispositions at work. So as civil society is a broad church, as you would say, you have these debates as well. In general, I would say from an ecological point of view, the problem is not so much whether the planet has 7 or 8 or 9 billion people. The problem is how many people out of these 9 billion are members of the global consumer class. This class is the problem. The global consumer class lives like human beings. Travels by plane, has a car, goes into supermarkets, does shopping with products from all over the world, and consumes a lot of electricity, and is maybe proud that this electricity comes now from windmills and not from coal-fired power plants anymore, but it's still a lot. And all these people that live like most Germans live, like 120 million Indians live, like 200 million Chinese live, like the United States live. This consumer class is the environmental problem. They destroy the planet. This lifestyle destroys the planet. You and me, we are the problem. The poor farmer in Sudan that is not part of the world market, he's not. And that's why the SDGs are right when they address not only poverty alleviation, but also the consumer class has to do something. They don't say it openly, because the people negotiating it, also the civil society part of it, are members of that consumer class, 100%. Somebody who flies to New York to negotiate SDGs is a member of the consumer class. Somebody who sits in his farm in Kenya and has nothing to do with the world market does not negotiate these goals. So the consumer class is asked to criticize itself with this SDGs. This is a difficult job, believe me. Even for NGOs, it's very difficult. And this is my take on it. And apart from that, I think what is also important is empowerment of women to make a decision how many children they want. This is also lacking in many parts of the world, and if you change that fact, you do a lot for the population equation. I think this is not only my opinion, it's an NGO opinion, more or less. But of course, it's a debate that is also, many people shy that debate because it's full of minds. One wrong sentence and you are politically incorrect and they will throw stones at you.
Thank you. I would like to ask a quick question. What are the big things that are left to be done until September? And what are you going to do in preparation for September?
Well, the big things, to be honest, I would be happy in one respect if the international community and the governments of the world in one way don't do very much at all. That is the open-ended working group's proposal of 17 goals and 169 targets is way better than we ever expected would come out of this group. So a number of governments try to water it down. And my expectation, and I'm quite optimistic, my expectation is simply to keep it as much as possible as it is. So if governments would start to reopen that package, I would be very unhappy. But I'm happy when they don't do that and focus their debates on review, implementation, and maybe this not so important declaration, the blah blah part of it, which for many governments is very important. So that is until September. The real work starts after that. When our job is A, to make sure that this agenda is taken more seriously than previous UN decisions, more seriously than Agenda 21, and is taken as a reference point for domestic policies in as many countries as possible, including my own country. Let me go to the government and say, well, now you have agreed with that. What is your national implementation plan? What, you don't have one? Let's discuss one. This will be the job then. But so, as you can hear, I'm a little bit hesitant to make too much pum-pum before September because a lot of people are worried the result could be in the end worse than what is now on the table.
I think giving health insurance, for example, to the Greek is probably a lot more costly than getting people out of poverty in Burkina Faso, just as an example. So do the SDGs take a global perspective, or is it rather a national perspective, pinpointing countries down to what they do?
Since we are not talking about a world government, we are talking about 200 governments of countries. So the SDGs will be a blueprint for every government what to do. Now we're talking about a global partnership, of course. That means you also talk about support for the LDCs, for poor countries to achieve their goals. That is true. But most of it, even in the old MDGs, was national commitments by governments to channel their policies towards implementation. And now, of course, in a country like Greece, you cannot expect that the Greek government, broke as it is, will promise more money for Burkina Faso. They're not going to do that because they don't have that money. So their focus will be their domestic situation. The same is true for Burkina Faso. The global partnership means money, yes, but it means, first of all, every country focusing on its own policy. Without that, you can pour as much money as you want into onto a government. It's pointless. Is that a good answer? Or was it too diplomatic?
Yeah. Well, we need to wrap up, but I want to sneak a question in, actually. I just wanted to ask, what do you think the role is for scientific communities like ourselves with the SDGs in terms of whether the implementation, the finance, or without it, but the follow-up and so on? And I ask this especially because in the NGO world, more NGOs have started adding research to what they do, as opposed to just monitoring and evaluation. But I was just wondering, as a final goal, what you thought, or if you even thought about us at all in this.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, we talk a lot to scientists because we also commission studies and we, of course, use scientific results in the political debate. Generally, I think scientists are a little bit in the same position as NGOs. We are both important components of civil society, but governments have the predisposition to listen to us only when the message is a message they like. But if we come with a message the government doesn't like, oh, yes, we ignore it. So, secondly, what we also have in common, that scientists very often are a little bit above what we call realpolitik. Yeah? You said these goals are far too lofty, they will never be implemented. Yeah, of course, you can say that. But a lot of the scientists come up with all kinds of constructions and models that are likewise completely unrealistic. So my take on that would be the scientific community can do a very important service if they show politicians and maybe even NGOs realistic ways to come closer to these aims. Sometimes we also don't know how to implement things. So we lobby governments and we have to tell governments, look, we actually don't really know what you should do. We only want to tell you should think about it. We also think about it, but I cannot give you a solution. This happens. We are not superstars, yeah? So the scientific community sometimes can say, yeah, okay, we have never seen economic growth without carbon dioxide emissions rising so far. But in theory, we know it's possible with all these renewable energies. Now let's come with realistic development models. Just one example. Or fisheries management. How many times have we decided to limit fisheries catch and it never happened? How can you implement that? Simply with more surveillance and more gunboats? Arresting fisher boats? Whatever? No, probably not. You need new ideas, more practical approaches. This is what I want from the scientific community, because many times I think scientists and NGOs share the same problem, that we are not. We think it's enough when we come with the wonderful ideas, and implementation is the job of politicians. And when you leave that job to politicians, very often they make a very bad job of it because they don't really want to implement it. So this is where we have a similar role, I think.
Well, thank you very much.